Commander Jack Reynolds slammed her file onto the briefing table so hard the coffee cups rattled. "This," he said, jabbing his finger at the folder, like it had personally offended him, "is a joke. A desk analyst with soft hands and zero trigger time thinks she belongs on my team." He looked around the room at his operators, men who had bled and buried brothers in 3 different wars, and he laughed. It was the kind of laugh that wasn't meant to be funny. It was meant to draw a line. And Emily Carter, standing at the far end of that table, heard every word. Before we go any further, if this kind of story moves you, please subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The morning Emily Carter arrived at the Naval Special Warfare Center in Coronado, California, she came alone. No entourage, no escort, no one waiting at the gate with a welcome packet and a warm handshake. She carried a single backpack over her left shoulder and wore tactical boots that had seen better days, and walked through the main entrance at exactly 0600 hours with the quiet, unhurried confidence of someone who already knew where she was going. The gate guard looked at her ID, looked at his clipboard, looked back at her ID, and then looked at her face one more time, like he was waiting for her to admit she had the wrong base. She didn't. "Carter Emily," she said, "Intelligence and Special Operations Assessment. I'm on the list." He found her name eventually. 3rd page down, tucked between 2 other entries, like someone had added it in at the last minute, without telling anyone it mattered. He waved her through without a word. That was the first sign, not the last. The Naval Special Warfare Center was not the kind of place that made newcomers feel welcome. It was designed to make people feel exactly the opposite. The buildings were functional, not friendly. The air smelled like salt and diesel and hard work that never quite finished. The training grounds stretched out in every direction with the specific purpose of reminding every person who set foot on them that this place had chewed through thousands of candidates before them and would chew through thousands more after. Emily had read every piece of declassified documentation about the facility she could legally access, and a few pieces she probably wasn't supposed to have. She knew the layout, she knew the culture, she knew the unit she was being assigned to evaluate. SEAL Team Vanguard 6. 11 operators, average age 32, combined combat deployments numbering somewhere in the range of 47, depending on which records you pulled and how deeply classified those deployments actually were. A unit with a success rate that made other special operations teams uncomfortable in the way that only genuine excellence can. They had never lost a mission. They had never lost a teammate, and they had never, not once in 8 years of operation, accepted an outsider who hadn't bled their way into the brotherhood the same way everyone else had. Emily Carter had not bled her way in. She had been assigned, and that she already knew was going to be the first problem. She found the briefing room on her own. 2nd floor, east quarter, 3rd door on the left. The door was already open, which meant she was either on time or slightly late, and neither option was going to earn her any points. She walked in. 11 heads turned. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then one of them, a broad-shouldered operator with a jaw like a cinder block and the kind of permanent sunburn you earn by spending too many years outdoors in bad situations, and leaned back in his chair and let out a slow breath through his nose. "Huh," he said. That was it, just that one syllable. But in the silence of that room, it carried the weight of an entire verdict. His name was Sergeant First Class Marcus Webb. 12 years in the teams, 4 overseas rotations, a man whose personal evaluation of any situation was considered so reliable that the others had stopped questioning it years ago. When Marcus Webb said "huh" about something, it meant exactly what it sounded like. "This is not what I expected, and not in a good way." Emily set her backpack down near the wall. She found an empty chair at the back corner of the room, the kind of seat that put her at maximum distance from the center of the action, without technically being invisible, and she sat down. She did not introduce herself. She did not look around for approval. She simply waited. That was the second sign that something was different about her. Most people entering a room full of strangers who are already judging them do one of 2 things. They either try to make themselves smaller, pulling their shoulders in and looking at the floor and pretending they can't feel the evaluation happening around them. Or they overcorrect, pushing their chin up and manufacturing a confidence that always looks exactly like what it is manufactured. Emily did neither. She simply occupied the space she was in without apology and without performance. It made the room feel different. Commander Jack Reynolds walked in 4 minutes later. He was not a tall man in the way that people sometimes imagine commanders to be, but he had the kind of physical presence that made height irrelevant. He moved like someone who had spent decades making decisions under pressure, every step deliberate, every gesture controlled. He had dark eyes that processed information faster than most people could gather it, in a face that had learned a long time ago how to reveal exactly nothing. He had been running Vanguard 6 for 3 years. Before that, he had spent 11 years as an operator himself, earning a reputation not for recklessness or bravado, but for something more dangerous. He was right about people, almost always. He read situations with an accuracy that his superiors had stopped questioning, and his subordinates had learned to fear, because being read accurately by someone like Reynolds meant having no place to hide. He walked to the front of the room, set his own folder on the table, and looked at his team. Then, because he already knew the answer, he looked at Emily. She looked back, not defiant, not eager, not nervous, just present. He picked up her file. The room was quiet enough that everyone could hear the sound of the pages turning. Reynolds read for almost a full minute without saying anything, which was unusual. Reynolds was not a man who needed a full minute to form an opinion. His opinions arrived fast, and they arrived complete. But something in that file was making him slow down. Finally, he set it back on the table. "Carter," he said. "Sir," she replied. "You want to tell me what you're doing here?" "I was assigned to the unit for an assessment period, sir. 30 days. I know what the orders say." He folded his hands on top of the folder. "I'm asking what you think you're doing here, in this room, with this team." Emily didn't flinch. "I'm here to contribute, sir." Reynolds tilted his head slightly. "Contribute." He let the words sit there alone for a moment, like he was deciding whether it was funny or just sad. "Let me tell you what I see when I look at your file, Carter. I see someone who has never been deployed in a combat role. I see someone who has never operated in a direct action environment. I see someone who spent the last 4 years sitting behind a desk analyzing signals intelligence and writing reports that other people acted on." He paused. "I see someone who is, with all due respect to whoever signed your orders, a paperwork mistake wearing boots." The room waited. This was the moment. This was where a person either cracked or showed you what they were actually made of. Reynolds had done this before. He had delivered harder lines to better prepared people and watched them fold under the weight of the words. Emily said, "Understood, Commander." Not, "That's not fair." Not, "I can prove myself." Not even a change in her breathing pattern. Just 2 words, calm and level, like he had told her the weather. The room didn't erupt in laughter the way it sometimes did when someone got dressed down. It went the other direction. It went quiet in the particular way that happens when a room full of experienced people encounters something they don't immediately know how to categorize. Marcus Webb stopped, leaning back in his chair. Corporal Danny Tran, the team's youngest operator at 28, and the one most likely to read any situation through the lens of whether something was entertaining, leaned forward almost imperceptibly. Reynolds looked at her for another moment. Then he opened the briefing and moved on. But he kept her file on the table in front of him, which he never did. That was the 3rd sign. The first week was supposed to break her. That was not a secret. No one inside Vanguard 6's training culture pretended otherwise. When a new candidate was attached to the unit, the first week was specifically designed to establish what Reynolds called baseline reality, which was his way of saying that he needed to know very quickly whether someone's file matched the person or whether the file was just good storytelling. He had seen plenty of good storytelling, decorated records that dissolved under actual pressure, intelligence officers who could brief a mission brilliantly and then fall apart the moment the mission changed, technical specialists who performed flawlessly in isolation but couldn't function when 4 other people were counting on them simultaneously. The first week was not about making Emily Carter fail. Reynolds would have said that clearly if anyone asked. It was about making her tell the truth. Day 1 started at 04:30. Emily was awake at 04:15, not because someone told her to be, not because she set an alarm, but because she had learned a long time ago that the first rule of any new environment is that you never let the environment set the pace for you before you've had a chance to study it. She arrived at the first muster point before anyone else, including the instructors. Sergeant First Class Webb arrived 2 minutes later and found her standing there in the pre-dawn darkness, backpack already secured, looking like she had been there for an hour. He stopped walking, looked at her. She looked back. "You're early," he said. "I know," she replied. He nodded once and walked to his position without saying anything else, but something shifted in his face just slightly. Not approval, not yet, but a crack in the certainty that she didn't belong. The physical conditioning circuit on day one was brutal by any standard. 7 miles of mixed terrain running at a pace designed not to kill but to locate the exact edge of where each person's body started making negotiations with their mind. Followed by water work, then rucking with loaded packs across a course that had been intentionally designed to maximize both physical strain and mental disorientation. Emily was not the fastest. She was not going to be. She had never pretended otherwise, not even to herself. The operators of Vanguard 6 had spent years pushing their physical limits in ways that built a kind of muscular endurance she hadn't had the context to develop. They were stronger, faster, and more adapted to sustained physical punishment than she was. But here was what happened. She didn't try to compete on those terms. During the running circuit, she maintained a pace that was below theirs, but absolutely consistent. No fluctuation, no burning of reserves she would need later. While 2 of the team's operators had to slow down in the final 2 miles because they had gone out too fast and were now paying the biological debt of their early aggression, Emily ran the last mile at the same pace she had run the first. She crossed the finish line 4th. The 2 operators who had opened with bravado came in 7th and 9th. Nobody said anything about it, but Webb noticed, and Danny Tran, who crossed in 2nd and was scanning the group as they came in because he always wanted to know where everyone else was noticed too. During the water work, the real test happened. The water temperature was 49 degrees. It was supposed to be 49 degrees. This was not accidental. This was a very specific temperature, because at 49 degrees, the human body begins losing its physical coordination at a measurable rate, and the gap between what a person believes they can do and what their body will actually do starts to close very quickly. One of the team's newer members, a 29-year-old operator named Garrett Cole, who had joined Vanguard 6 from a Ranger unit 8 months earlier and was still in the process of proving himself, went into distress at the 11-minute mark. It was subtle, the kind of subtle that an untrained eye would miss entirely. Emily was 60 yards away when she saw it. She saw his stroke pattern change. The rhythm broke in a way that wasn't fatigue. It was the specific neurological disruption that happens when the body starts pulling blood from the extremities to protect the core organs. She recognized it because she had studied cold water physiology, not as an abstract academic exercise, but as a survival problem she had personally decided to solve. She changed direction before anyone else in the water had processed what was happening. She reached Cole in 40 seconds, got one arm around him, kept him above the surface, signaled to the shore, and then after the support team had him, she turned around and completed the remainder of the water course. When she climbed out, she was the last one out. She stood on the dock, dripping cold water onto cold concrete, and she looked at nothing in particular while her body worked through the process of re-regulating. An instructor named Petty Officer 2nd Class Rhonda Matthews, one of the few women in a support role at the facility and someone who had seen enough training cycles to be skeptical of almost everything, walked up to Emily with a towel and said quietly, "You didn't have to go back in." Emily took the towel. "Yes, I did," she said. Matthews looked at her for a moment. "Why?" Emily thought about it for a second. Not because she didn't have an answer, but because she was deciding whether the answer she had was the right one to give out loud. "Because not going back wasn't an option I was willing to accept," she said. Matthews walked away without responding, but she was thinking about those words for the rest of the day, and so was every instructor who had been watching. The problem, as Reynolds saw it after reviewing the day one footage that evening in his office, was not that Emily Carter had underperformed. The problem was that she hadn't, and the way she hadn't underperformed was more unsettling than if she had simply exceeded expectations in the straightforward way that talented candidates sometimes did. A talented candidate running fast or swimming strong was easy to categorize. It fit the mental model Reynolds had for what excellence looked like in this environment. Emily's kind of performance didn't fit any model he already had. She wasn't excelling by the team's metrics. She was excelling by metrics that the team hadn't thought to apply to themselves, and that was a much harder thing to file away neatly. He pulled up her psychological evaluation from the program that had sent her. Read it again. Looked at the notes from the 3 separate evaluating agencies whose names he recognized as organizations that did not officially exist. He closed the file, poured himself a glass of water, and started reconsidering his first assessment, not because he wanted to, but because he was a man who had built his reputation on accuracy, and accuracy sometimes required him to do things that were uncomfortable. Day 3 was when the team's active resistance began. Up until that point, the operators of Vanguard 6 had maintained a posture of collective skepticism expressed through silence and distance. They hadn't gone out of their way to make Emily's life difficult. They had simply done what people do when they don't believe someone belongs somewhere. They had arranged themselves in a way that made that person feel the borders. No eye contact during meals. No acknowledgement during transitions between training blocks. No offered assistance. No information sharing of the small operational kind that teams develop naturally over time, like who knows the shortcut to the equipment room or which instructor is going to push the hardest on which exercise. Emily moved through this environment like it wasn't happening to her, not like she didn't notice, but like she had decided in advance that the social architecture of the team's rejection was information to observe rather than an experience to react to. That changed on day 3 when someone switched her equipment. It happened during a pre-dawn gear check before a navigation exercise. Emily went to her assigned kit and found that her high-resolution topographic map had been replaced with a version that was 18 months old and missing significant terrain updates. Her compass had been swapped for one with a magnetic variance that would produce errors of between 12 and 15 degrees in this specific geographic area. In her backup navigation tool, a GPS unit had been switched for a unit with a dead battery. She discovered all 3 problems in the 7 minutes she had between gear issue and departure. She did not report it. She did not make a scene. She did not confront anyone. She made a mental inventory of what she had and what she was missing, recalculated her approach to the exercise based on available assets, and moved out when the exercise began. What nobody told Emily and what Emily didn't know was that a small thermal imaging sensor had been placed along the navigation route specifically to capture how she responded when the equipment failed. Reynolds wasn't watching to see if she succeeded. He was watching to see how she thought when the world didn't cooperate with her preparation. The navigation exercise was supposed to take 2 hours. Emily completed it in 1 hour and 41 minutes. Using stars of vegetation patterns slope analysis in the one landmark, her degraded map was still accurate enough to confirm. When she reached the endpoint and was logged in by the waiting observer, the observer looked at his watch and then at her and said, "You're using a dead GPS and a bad compass." "I noticed," Emily said. "And a wrong map." "I noticed that too." "So how did you do it?" Emily thought for a moment. Then she said something that the observer would later write down word for word in his notes because he didn't want to get it wrong when he reported it. "The ground is always telling you where you are," she said. "Most people stop listening to it when they have technology. I just listen to the ground." The observer said nothing. He logged her completion time. He wrote down her words. And that night, he sent a message to the program supervisor 3 levels above Reynolds that said simply, "Day 3, she's the real thing." The sabotage of her equipment was not what bothered Reynolds when he learned about it the following morning. Equipment tampering in training environments happened. It was not sanctioned, but it was not unheard of, and he had seen it before. What bothered him was that Emily hadn't come to him. He called her into his office that afternoon. She stood at ease across from his desk, hands clasped behind her back, waiting. "Someone interfered with your gear on day 3, he said. "I'm aware of it, though." "You didn't report it?" "No, sir." "Why?" She held his gaze for a moment before answering. "Because reporting it would have been asking the environment to solve a problem I was capable of solving myself," she said. "And I didn't want to teach anyone here that I solve problems by reporting them." Reynolds was quiet for a long moment. "You knew I'd find out." "I assumed you'd find out," she said. "I didn't plan for it either way." He leaned back slightly. "You're not going to ask me who did it?" "No, sir." "Why not?" "Because knowing who did it wouldn't change what I do next," she said. "And what I do next is what matters." Reynolds stared at her for another few seconds. Then he said in a voice that had lost a little of the edge it normally carried, "Dismissed." She left. He sat alone in his office for a while after that. not thinking about the case against her anymore. Thinking about the case for her and the uncomfortable realization that the case for her was getting harder and harder to argue with. By the end of the first week, three things had become clear inside Vanguard 6. The first was that Emily Carter was not going to fail in the obvious ways they had expected. The second was that some members of the team were not ready to let go of the expectation that she would. The third was that the person in the room who was being tested most thoroughly was not Emily. It was the team itself. Marcus Webb was the first to say anything about it out loud. Not to Reynolds and not to Emily. He said it to Danny Tran on the evening of day 7 while they were both sitting in the equipment bay doing post-maintenance checks that didn't technically need to be done, but gave them something to occupy their hands while they thought. "She's not what I thought she was," Webb said. Tran didn't look up from what he was doing. "None of us are what she thought we were either." Webb looked at him. "What does that mean?" Tran set down the tool he was using and looked at the wall for a moment. "She came in here knowing exactly who we were going to be to her," he said, "and she decided in advance what she was going to do about it, which was nothing." He picked the tool. "Back up. That's not an accident. That's a strategy." Webb was quiet for a moment. "She saved Garrett in the water." "Yeah. She didn't have to. She seemed to think she did." "That's what I mean," Webb said. "That's what I'm saying." Tran nodded slowly. They finished their maintenance checks in silence, but something had changed between them. Not just about Emily, about the way they were looking at what the previous 7 days had actually been, about who had been making choices and who had been reacting, about what the difference between those two things looked like when you stopped assuming you already knew the answer. That was the end of the first week. And nobody, not Reynolds, not Webb, not Tran, and not Emily Carter herself, could honestly say they knew exactly where the next 3 weeks were going to go. But Emily had one advantage over all of them. She already knew what they were going to try, and she had already decided what she was going to do. Nothing. She was going to do exactly what she came here to do. She was going to show up every single day, without apology, without performance, without waiting for anyone's permission to be exactly who she was. And that more than her survival skills, more than her navigation ability, more than any specific technical capability she possessed, was the thing that was going to make this team uncomfortable for the next 3 weeks, in ways they didn't yet have words for. Because the hardest thing in any environment is not the person who fights back. The hardest thing is the person who doesn't need to. Emily Carter was that person. And somewhere deep in the parts of themselves that had nothing to do with training, or tactics, or years of hard-earned expertise, every single member of Vanguard 6 was beginning slowly against everything they thought they believed to feel it. The second week started with a meeting that Emily was not invited to. Reynolds called his senior operators into his office at 0500 on day 8, before the morning brief, before the training schedule kicked in, before anyone had a chance to set the tone of the day. He closed the door, which was unusual. Reynolds was not a man who closed doors unless the conversation inside needed to stay there. Webb, Tran, and 4 of the other senior operators stood around the room in the specific way that people stand when they know something important is about to be said and they're not sure whether they're going to agree with it. Reynolds put Emily's performance summary from week 1 on his desk. He didn't push it toward anyone. He just let it sit there. "She passed everything," he said. Nobody responded. Not just passed, performed. He crossed his arms. Waterwork, navigation, conditioning gear adaptation. Every single block. Sergeant Luis Vargas, who had been with the team for 6 years and had a particular talent for identifying the exact center of any argument, said, "She's not performing at our level." "No," Reynolds agreed. "She's performing at her own level, which, as it turns out, is high enough to make the question of our level less interesting than it was a week ago." The room shifted. Not loudly, just the small adjustments of people recalibrating where they stood on something. Webb said, "What are you telling us, Commander?" Reynolds looked at him for a moment. "I'm telling you that whatever we thought we knew about Carter when she walked in last Monday is not matching what we're seeing, and I want to know why." Tran leaned against the wall with his arms folded. "So what do? We find out," Reynolds said. "We push harder. We go beyond standard protocol, and we find out where the edge is, because everyone has one." He said the last sentence with absolute certainty, which was the first sign that his certainty in this particular case might be the thing that got them all into trouble. The second week was designed to be different from the first. Reynolds adjusted the training architecture with the specific intention of creating conditions that were less about raw physical endurance and more about the kind of sustained compounding pressure that revealed psychological fractures. Because that was where he believed the truth about Emily Carter was hidden. Not in her body, which had proven itself adequate, but in her mind. He started with isolation. On day 8, Emily was given a separate training schedule from the rest of the team. Different locations, different instructors, different timing. On paper, it looked like individualized assessment. In practice, it meant that she was being evaluated without the social infrastructure that most candidates, even excellent ones, leaned on without realizing it. Because here was the thing about elite units that nobody discussed in the recruitment literature. The physical training was brutal, yes, but the physical training was survivable precisely because you were surrounded by people surviving it with you. The shared suffering of a team created a current that individual effort alone couldn't replicate. When someone next to you was struggling, you dug deeper. When someone next to you succeeded, it recalibrated your definition of possible. Isolation removed all of that. Emily went through day 8 alone, 7 hours of rotating assessments, decision-making exercises under time pressure, problem-solving scenarios where the information she was given was deliberately incomplete, stress inoculation protocols that involve sustained audio distraction, sleep debt, simulation, and repeated task interruption at the moment of highest cognitive load. When she came in for her evening evaluation, the assessing instructor, a behavioral psychologist named Dr. Carl Hooper, who worked as a contractor for the program that had sent Emily, looked at her performance data and then looked at her face and said, "How are you doing?" Emily thought about the question seriously for a moment, which was in itself data. "Tired," she said. "That's all. That's the honest answer." Hooper wrote something in his notes. Most candidates after a day like today present one of two things. Either they're minimizing, which means they're performing resilience for an audience, or they're catastrophizing, which means the stress is finding the cracks. He looked up. "You said tired, just tired." "I said that's the honest answer," Emily said. "I didn't say it was a small one." Hooper smiled slightly and wrote something else. "Get some sleep," he said. She did. 6 hours, which was all the schedule allowed. And she made the 6 hours count in the specific way that people with strong survival instincts learn to do, not because it comes naturally, but because they have decided that it is non-negotiable. Day 9 brought the next escalation. Reynolds had arranged what he called a team integration exercise, which was his way of putting Emily back into the group environment, but with the specific variable changed. Instead of being observed from the outside, she was now going to be placed inside scenarios where her actions directly affected the team's outcomes. The first scenario was straightforward enough on the surface. A simulated building clearance exercise working through a structure with multiple rooms, multiple variables, and multiple potential contacts. Standard direct action stuff that the operators of Vanguard 6 could run in their sleep. But Reynolds had given the team a specific brief the night before that Emily had not received. The scenario had a hidden objective, not the official objective printed on the mission brief, a second objective that only the team knew about, which meant that during the exercise, they would be making decisions based on information Emily didn't have access to, which meant she would be structurally one step behind, responding to a reality she couldn't fully see. Reynolds wanted to know what she did when she was the least informed person in the room. What happened in that exercise was something nobody in the planning team had anticipated. Emily went first, not because she was assigned to. The entry sequence had her positioned 4th in the stack. But when the team moved to the first position and the lead operator, a man named Corporal Hatch, who had done this exercise 50 times and was running it in automatic mode set up for entry, Emily said quietly from the back of the stack, "Left side, 3rd room. The setup is wrong." Hatch half turned his head. "What? The geometry of this building," she said, keeping her voice low, keeping her eyes on the structure. "If this is modeled on the brief, we were given the 3rd room on the left side has a sight line that covers the main corridor from an angle that isn't in any of our clearance lanes. We go in the way we're set up, that room controls us before we ever see it." There was a pause. Hatch looked at the team's tactical coordinator, a man named Senior Chief Petty Officer Brando, who was running the scenario from a slightly elevated position. Brando looked at the building. Then he looked at his own notes. Then he looked at the building again. She's right, he said quietly enough that it felt like the words cost him something. The team adjusted their entry sequence. They ran the scenario. When it was over and they were in the debrief, Reynolds asked Hatch directly, "What happened at the entry point?" Hatch kept his expression flat. "Carter identified a sightline issue. We corrected." Reynolds nodded slowly. "How long had you been looking at that entry point?" 20 minutes. "And she identified it in how long?" Hatch was quiet. 30 seconds, Brando said from the back of the room. "Maybe less." Reynolds wrote something on his notepad. Then he said, "Carter, what made you look at that room?" Emily said. "The proportions of the building didn't match the typical floor plan for that construction type, which meant either the room was smaller than it appeared from outside or there was an interior partition that wasn't on the diagram. Either way, the sight lines in the original plan weren't accounting for what was actually there." "How do you know construction types?" "I read about them," she said. The room was quiet. "You read about them," Reynolds repeated. "I read about a lot of things," she said. "I never know which one is going to matter." Reynolds looked at her for a long moment. Then he moved on to the next debrief item. But he moved on with the specific cadence of a man who has just heard something he's going to be thinking about for the rest of the day. Day 10 was when the team's resistance escalated from institutional to personal. It started with Vargas. Vargas was not a cruel man by nature, but he was a proud one, and pride, when it's been threatened by something it can't categorize, has a way of expressing itself as hostility toward whatever is doing the threatening. After the morning conditioning run, Vargas approached Emily in the equipment bay while she was resetting her gear. "You think you were helping out there," he said, "with the building thing." Emily looked at him. "I think I noticed something relevant," she said. "You think it's your job to notice things in a team environment?" "It's everyone's job to notice things in a team environment," she said evenly. Vargas took a step closer, not aggressive exactly, but not nothing either. "We've been operating together for years. We have systems. We have methods. We have trust built on a foundation that you walked in here last Monday and have no part of. And you standing up in a stack that isn't yours and calling out geometry like you wrote the building codes is not team integration. It's noise." Wow. Emily put down the gear she was holding. She looked at Vargas for a moment. Then she said, "If the sightline issue I identified had been wrong, I would have cost the team 4 seconds in some embarrassment. If I'd stayed quiet because I didn't want to create noise and the issue was real, then the cost would have been different." She picked the gear back up. "I'm not trying to replace your systems. I'm trying to make sure we all get out of the room." Vargas stared at her. "That's a nice way to say you think you know better than us." "That's a nice way to hear it," she said. "But that's not what I said." She finished resetting her gear and walked out of the bay. Vargas stood there for a moment, alone in the room with what she'd said. And for the first time since she arrived, something in him shifted. Not much, not yet. But it was there, the small, uncomfortable crack that opens up when a person realizes they've been arguing against a position that wasn't actually the one being taken. He stood there for another few seconds. Then he walked out too. Day 12 brought the first twist that nobody inside the unit saw coming. It came in the form of a classified communication that Reynolds received at 0700. He read it twice. Then he sat alone in his office for 10 minutes, which was 8 minutes longer than he typically needed to process information of any kind. The communication was from the program that had sent Emily. It informed Reynolds for the first time that Emily's assignment to Vanguard 6 was not a standard assessment attachment. It was a dual assessment. She was being evaluated, yes, but so were they. And the evaluation criteria for the team were specifically centered on one thing: whether they could recognize and integrate unconventional talent without the prompt of a top-down directive. Whether they could on their own, without being told to look at someone who didn't fit their existing model of excellence and decide that the model might need expanding. Reynolds read the document a third time. Then he opened his desk drawer and pulled out the physical copy of Emily's file, the one he had slammed on the briefing table on the first day, and he looked at it from a different angle than he had before, because now he understood something. The file wasn't impossible. The file was documentation of a person who had spent years developing capabilities that conventional military training pipelines didn't know how to produce because they didn't know how to ask for them. And the person who had compiled that file, whoever they were, and whatever agency they actually worked for, had sent Emily to Vanguard 6 specifically because Vanguard 6 was the kind of unit that needed to learn how to see past their own expertise. Reynolds sat with that for a while. Then he made a decision. He didn't tell the team what the communication said, not because he was hiding it, but because telling them would change the test. And the test he now understood was not over. The second week of training was the week Marcus Webb stopped sleeping properly. Not because of workload or physical fatigue, though both of those were present, but because of a specific kind of cognitive dissonance that happens when a person who is very good at reading situations discovers that they have been misreading one. Webb had been in the special operations long enough to have developed an almost unconscious ability to evaluate people. It wasn't arrogance. It was survival. In his world, bad reads got people killed. So he had spent years sharpening his instincts about human beings the way other people sharpened blades. He had read Emily Carter as someone who didn't belong. He had been doing that read since the moment she walked through the gate on day 1. And now 11 days in every piece of evidence he had collected was telling him that his initial read had been wrong. That was not a comfortable thing for Webb to sit with. He lay awake on the night of day 12, running back through the week's events with the specific attention of a man conducting his own internal investigation. The waterwork on day 1 where she'd gone back in for Garrett, the navigation exercise where she'd stripped down to starlight and terrain and still come in ahead of 2 guys with functioning equipment. The building clearance where she'd spotted in 30 seconds what the team hadn't caught in 20 minutes. And today, in the afternoon's communication exercise, where she had deciphered an encrypted signal pattern using a method none of them recognized, because it was, as she explained afterward, with no particular emphasis, a technique she had read about in an academic paper on historical cipher systems. An academic paper, in her free time, because she never knew which thing was going to matter. Webb stared at the ceiling of his bunk room. "She's been doing this for years," he said to the dark room. He wasn't talking to anyone, but Tran was awake in the next bunk and heard him. "Doing what?" Tran said. "Preparing for things that don't exist yet," Webb said. "She's not training for the last mission. She's training for the next one, the one nobody has thought of yet." Tran was quiet for a moment. "Is that what she's doing?" he said. "That's what she's been doing the whole time," Webb said. "We've been trying to test her on our standards. She's been operating on her own standards the entire time. And her standards are..." He trailed off. "Higher," Tran said. "Different," Webb corrected. "Not just higher. Different in a way that makes some of what we think of as high actually look like it's missing the point." That was a hard thing to say. Tran knew how hard it was because he felt it land in his own chest the moment Webb said it. They lay there in the dark for a while, not sleeping. Day 13 was the day Emily made her first mistake. It was small. In the context of the overall training week, it barely registered on any official evaluation metric. But it registered with Emily, which was the only metric that ultimately mattered in the long run. The exercise involved multi-source intelligence synthesis. Multiple streams of information arriving simultaneously with the specific intent of creating cognitive overload. The task was to prioritize, identify the critical data, and make a decision within a defined time window. Emily's synthesis was correct on the primary objective, but she missed a secondary signal buried in the third data stream. A signal that in a real operational context would have been low priority, but not zero priority. When the after action was presented, the instructor flagged it. Emily acknowledged it before he finished the sentence. "Third stream secondary signal, 17 minutes in. I deprioritized it and should have flagged it for follow-up even if I wasn't acting on it directly. I won't make that specific error again." The instructor blinked. In a decade of running assessments, he had never had a candidate identify their own error before he finished describing it. "That's correct," he said. "Do you need me to explain my reasoning for the deprioritization?" she asked. "That would be helpful, yes." She walked through her thinking from that moment in precise, ordered language. Not defensive, not apologetic, analytical the way a surgeon describes what happened in an operation that didn't go the way it was supposed to. The instructor looked at her for a moment after she finished. "You already knew you missed it," he said. "I knew before I finished the exercise," she said. "Knowing and being able to correct in real time are 2 different problems." He wrote for a long time in his notes after she left. He wrote things like self-assessment accuracy exceptional and learning architecture live not retrospective. And at the bottom of the page, underlined once, "This is not normal." Day 15 was the day Garrett Cole found Emily in the gym at 0200. He had been having trouble sleeping ever since the water incident on day 1. Not because of the near drowning, though that had rattled him more than he'd told anyone, but because of what happened after. He had not thanked her. He told himself it was because the moment had passed, because bringing it up afterward in the culture of this unit would create more awkwardness than it resolved. Because operators didn't dwell on moments where they needed help, they folded those moments into the ongoing story of their competence and moved forward. But the real reason was that he hadn't thanked her because doing so would have required him to look at her and see something other than the outsider he had decided she was, and he wasn't ready for that on day 1. He found her working through a controlled strength sequence at 0200, not frantically, but with the kind of deliberate, measured effort that was almost meditative. She heard him come in, registered his presence, and kept working. He sat on a bench nearby and watched for a moment. Then he said, "You should have let me go." She stopped what she was doing and looked at him. "In the water," he said, "Day 1, Moam. You should have let me go and finish the course." "No," she said simply. "It would have been better for you, better for how they see you, stopping to pull someone out when you're already at a physical disadvantage in an evaluation that's not a smart play." "Maybe," she said, "but leaving you there wasn't something I was going to do." Cole looked at his hands for a moment. Then he looked back at her. "Why you don't know me? You didn't owe me anything." Emily thought about it for a second. "I don't think it works that way," she said. "You're not someone I owe a debt to. You're someone I was in the water with. That's enough." Cole was quiet for a moment. "I didn't say thank you," he said. "I know. I'm saying it now." Emily held his gaze for a moment. "Okay," she said. "Not you're welcome. Not it was nothing. Just okay, because it wasn't nothing and they both knew it, and pretending otherwise would have been its own kind of disrespect." Cole nodded once, got up, walked toward the door. Then he stopped. "Carter," he said without turning around. "Yeah. Webb thinks you're the real thing." She didn't say anything. "I'm starting to think he's right," Cole said. Then he walked out. Emily stood alone in the gym for a moment after he left. She didn't smile. She didn't exhale in relief. She didn't feel the satisfaction of someone who had just been validated after 2 weeks of pressure. She felt something more complex than any of those things. Something that lived in the space between gratitude and grief because the kindness of that moment made the difficulty of the preceding ones more visible, not less. And she allowed herself to feel exactly that, briefly, completely, and then she set it down and went back to work. Because the work was not done, it was a long way from done. The real escalation of week 2 came on day 16. Reynolds called a full team assembly at 1500, everyone present, including Emily. He stood at the front of the room with no notes, no file, no prepared remarks. He simply said, "We're running the water extraction scenario tomorrow. Full team, full kit, full operational parameters. Carter, you're assigned to the primary infiltration element." The room went completely still. The water extraction scenario, was not a training exercise in the standard sense. It was a compressed operational simulation that the team used to evaluate readiness for actual missions. Real equipment, real stakes within the simulation framework. Real decision-making with real consequences for failure. And the primary infiltration element was not a place you put someone to protect them. It was the place you put the people you trusted most. Or Reynolds understood in a completely different way, it was the place you put someone when you needed to know the absolute truth about them in a context that had no room for ambiguity. Vargas kept his expression flat. Webb looked at Reynolds for one additional second. Emily said nothing. After the assembly broke, Tran fell into step beside Emily in the corridor. "He's putting you at the tip of the spear," Tran said quietly. "I heard," she said. "That's either because he believes in you," Tran said, "or because he wants to know something that standard evaluation can't tell him." Emily walked for a few steps without responding. Then she said, "Both can be true." Tran looked at her sideways. "Are you nervous?" "Yes," she said. He raised his eyebrows slightly. He hadn't expected that answer. "Are you going to let it change anything?" he asked. "No," she said. He nodded once. They parted ways at the end of the corridor. And Tran walked back to the equipment bay, thinking about what it meant that the person he'd been watching underestimate for 2 weeks had just told him she was nervous with the same matter-of-fact directness that most people reserve for reporting their location. Not hiding it, not performing it, just naming it and moving past it. Like that was what competence had surely looked like when it was real. The water extraction simulation on day 17 ran for 4 hours. Emily was at the tip of the primary element for all of it. She made 2 decisions that departed from protocol. Both were called out in the immediate aftermath by Vargas, who was tracking deviations with the attentiveness of someone collecting evidence. The first departure came at the 22-minute mark when she changed the approach vector without calling it over comms first. The second came at the 58-minute mark when she held the team's advance for 40 seconds longer than the protocol specified. Both decisions were wrong by the book. Both decisions were right by the situation. Reynolds reviewed the footage afterward. Then he reviewed it again. He mapped every decision point against the environmental data, the observable variables, and the outcomes. The first departure had avoided a simulated detection event that the scenario's automated system would have triggered. The 40-second hold had allowed a secondary movement pattern to resolve that, if they had advanced on schedule, would have placed 2 team members in a simulated compromised position. Reynolds sat with this for a long time, because what he was looking at was not someone who was ignoring protocol. What he was looking at was someone who was reading a situation faster than the protocol was designed to account for and making corrections in real time while simultaneously managing the team's trust by taking the risk of those corrections entirely onto herself. She didn't ask permission, because asking permission would have required explanation. An explanation would have required time. And in those situations, time was the thing they didn't have. Reynolds leaned back in his chair. He thought about all the operators he had seen in his career who understood protocol better than the situation, and all the operators who understood the situation better than the protocol, and how rare it was to find someone who understood both well enough to know precisely which one to defer to when they were in conflict. He pulled up Emily's file again. This time he read it differently. Not looking for the cracks in the story, looking for the story itself. And this time it made a different kind of sense. He closed the file. He called Hooper. "Tell me what you see in her," he said. Hooper was quiet for a moment. "You've already seen it," he said. "You're calling me because you want someone to confirm what you don't want to admit you believe." Reynolds was quiet. "She's not a candidate," Jack Hooper said, using his first name for the first time since the program began. "She's not even an evaluator. She's something the program didn't exactly design for, but that the program was specifically hoping would emerge." He paused. "She's a standard, a living one, and she's been one since before she got here." Reynolds said nothing for a long moment. "Who sent her?" he said finally. "You know I can't tell you that." "Give me something." "I'll give you this," Hooper said. "Whoever sent her was watching to see if you'd recognize what you were looking at before you tried to destroy it." Another pause. "How are you doing on that, Jack?" Reynolds ended the call. He sat in his office as the late evening settled around the base. Outside, the lights of the training facility were still on. A few members of the team were running a night conditioning circuit that wasn't scheduled, the kind of extra work that operators do when they're too wound up to stop, when something in the week has gotten under their skin, and the only way to process it is through their bodies. Reynolds watched them through his office window. Then he looked at the seat across from his desk. The seat where Emily had sat on day 3 when he told her about the equipment sabotage, and she looked him in the eye and said that knowing who did it wouldn't change what she did next. He thought about that for a long time, and somewhere in the thinking and the honest, uncomfortable solitude of a man who had built his reputation on being right about people and was now reckoning with what it meant to have been wrong, Jack Reynolds began quietly to change his mind, not all at once, not loudly, not with any announcement, just the slow, irreversible shift of a genuine recalibration. He picked up his pen and opened a new notebook, and on the first page he wrote 2 words. Not Emily Carter's name, not the name of the program that sent her, just 2 words that captured what the second week of this evaluation had actually been about. 2 words that he hadn't expected to be writing when the week started. He looked at them for a moment, then he closed the notebook. Because the week wasn't over, and whatever was coming in week 3, Reynolds had a feeling it was going to make everything that had come before it look like an introduction. The team was already figuring it out on their own. Out on the conditioning circuit, Webb was running next to Cole, and Cole said without breaking stride, "She's been carrying things this whole time that we didn't ask about." "What do you mean?" Webb said. "I mean," Cole said, "that she's been in this unit for 16 days and she has never once made it about herself. Not one time. Not when they switched her gear. Not when Vargas came at her in the equipment bay. Not when Reynolds put her in the worst seat in every room." He ran for a few steps. "She's been carrying all of it and just continuing to show up." Webb ran beside him without speaking. Then he said, "You know what that is?" Cole shook his head. "That's what we say we are," Webb said. "That's the thing we tell each other this unit stands for. Put the mission first. Put the team first. Keep going regardless of what it costs you personally." He ran for a few more strides. "She's actually doing it. She's doing the thing we claim to be." Cole ran in silence for a while. "Then what have we been doing?" he said. Webb didn't answer, because the answer was already there between them, and it was uncomfortable enough without anyone saying it out loud. They ran the rest of the circuit without talking, and the base was quiet around them, and the lights were still on, and somewhere in the facility, Emily Carter was already asleep, because she had decided 6 hours of sleep was non-negotiable, and she kept every decision she made to herself. And in the morning, day 18 would come. And with it, something none of them had scheduled, none of them had prepared for, and none of them, including Reynolds, were going to be able to control. Day 18 began the way that all genuinely dangerous days begin, quietly. No announcement, no escalation in the morning brief. Reynolds ran the 0600 muster the same way he always did, same cadence, same eye contact, same controlled economy of words. He gave the team the day's schedule. He answered 2 questions from Webb about equipment inventory. He dismissed the muster at 0612. Nobody knew what was coming, except Reynolds and Hooper, who had been informed the night before and had spent most of the hours between midnight and 0400 sitting in his vehicle in the parking lot of the facility, thinking about whether what was planned was the right call. He had concluded that it was, not because it was comfortable, but because the story of the last 17 days had been building towards something. And the thing it had been building toward required a container big enough to hold the truth that all the smaller tests had been pointing at. The dead zone was that container. At 0900, Reynolds called a second assembly, unscheduled, which was unusual enough that the team filed in with the specific alertness of people who have learned that unscheduled things are where the real information lives. Emily was in the back row. Reynolds stood at the front without a folder, without notes, without anything in his hands. He looked at the team for a moment, the long measuring look of a man about to say something he has decided cannot be unsaid. Then he said, "We're going to the dead zone today." The room reacted in the specific way that rooms react when a word carries weight that outsiders can't fully understand. Not loud, not dramatic, just the compressed, involuntary response of people whose bodies have learned to take certain information seriously before their minds have finished processing it. Webb kept his face still, but his jaw tightened. Tran looked at the floor for 1 second, then back up. Vargas didn't move at all, which for Vargas was its own kind of reaction. Cole, sitting 2 seats to Emily's left, looked at the side of her face. She was looking straight ahead at Reynolds. "Carter," Reynolds said. "Sir," she replied. "You're running it solo. 15 minutes. Full kit, no support." The silence that followed that sentence was the loudest silence the room had produced in 18 days. Because everyone in that room understood what the dead zone was. They had all run it individually and in teams over the course of their time with Vanguard 6. They knew its geography the way you know the geography of a recurring nightmare. The unstable terrain, the automated systems, the environmental variables that the facility's engineers had spent years layering into the structure to create conditions that couldn't be predicted, only survived. Nobody ran it alone. That was not a myth or an exaggeration. It was a statement of operational reality. The dead zone was built on the principle that even the most capable individual needed redundancy. The protocol had always been minimum 2 standard 3 for the simple reason that the things that went wrong in there were specifically designed to overwhelm individual capacity. 15 minutes alone was not a training exercise. It was a statement. Vargas opened his mouth. Reynolds looked at him. Vargas closed it. Emily said, "Understood, sir. What time?" Reynolds looked at her for a moment. 1400. Roger that. She stood up, moved past the row of seats, and walked out of the room. The team watched her go. Then Webb turned to Reynolds and said in a voice low enough that it was clearly meant to be private, but loud enough that it wasn't "Commander" with respect. "That's not an evaluation, that's something else." Reynolds looked at him. "Is it?" "She's not ready for the dead zone solo," Webb said. "Nobody is. That's the point of the protocol." "Then we'll find out if the protocol is the ceiling," Reynolds said, "or just the floor." Webb stared at him for a moment. Then he turned and walked out. At 10:00, Emily went to the equipment room and drew her kit for the afternoon. Standard load, nothing special, nothing added. She laid it out on the bench and went through every item, methodically checking and rechecking, with the specific attention of someone who had learned on day 3 that the equipment she was issued was not always the equipment she'd find in it. Nothing had been tampered with. That, she noted, was its own kind of information. At 11:30, Webb found her. He knocked on the door frame of the equipment room, even though the door was already open. The knock of a man who wants to announce that he comes without agenda. She looked up. He walked in and stood a few feet away, not quite comfortable, not quite not. "You know what the dead zone is," he said. It wasn't a question. "I read the training documentation," she said. "The documentation doesn't cover what it actually is," he said. "The documentation is the technical specifications. What the dead zone is a psychological event with physical consequences. The two are not the same thing, and the gap between them is where people go wrong." Emily set down the item she was checking. "Then tell me about the gap," she said. Webb looked at her for a moment, like he was deciding something. Then he sat down on the bench across from her and clasped his hands in front of him. "The first thing that happens in there," he said, "is that the automated systems read your movement pattern in the first 60 seconds. They're calibrated to identify your baseline and then introduce disruptions that are specific to that baseline, which means the smarter your initial movement is, the more precisely the disruptions are targeted." He paused. "Most people who've trained extensively go in there and move the way they're trained to move, and the system responds to exactly that." "So training becomes a liability," Emily said. "In some configurations, yes." She thought about that. "What else?" she said. "The terrain in the northeast sector has a 2-second delay on weight distribution response, which means if you step on a surface that's going to shift, you won't know it for 2 seconds. By then, the correction window is already passed, and the secondary response is triggered." "What's the secondary response?" "Different every time," he said. "That's the point." Emily nodded slowly. Webb leaned forward slightly. "Carter, I need to ask you something." "Okay." "Are you scared?" She looked at him directly. "Yes." "Good," he said. "People who aren't scared in there are the ones who end up in trouble. The fear is data. It's your nervous system telling you that the stakes are real and your attention should match." He stood up. "Use it. Don't fight it. Use it." He walked toward the door. Then he stopped, and he said something that surprised both of them, Emily because she hadn't expected it, and Webb because he hadn't planned to say it. "I should have seen you sooner," he said. "Day 1. I should have seen what was actually in front of me." He didn't turn around. "I'm sorry I didn't." Emily was quiet for a moment. "You're seeing it now," she said. Webb nodded once to the door frame or to himself, it was hard to tell which. Then he walked out. At 12:15, Vargas came to find her. He stood in the doorway of the equipment room with his arms crossed and his expression complicated. The expression of a man who has an agenda but hasn't fully decided whether to commit to it. Emily looked at him and waited. "I want you to understand something," Vargas said. "What Reynolds is doing this afternoon, it's not evaluation, it's not training. It's him making a point." "What point?" she said. "That he can send you in there, and something about that will either confirm what he already thinks or give him something new to think." Vargas uncrossed his arms. "The problem is that the dead zone doesn't care about Reynolds' points. It only cares about whether you can survive the next 15 minutes. Emily held his gaze. "Is that you telling me to be careful?" Vargas was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "I guess it is." She looked at him for a moment longer. "Vargas," she said. "What?" "I heard what you said to me in the equipment bay on day 9. He looked at her. "About noise." "About noise," she said. "You were protecting something you built with people you trusted with your life. That's not a small thing. I understood that even then." Vargas said nothing for a moment. It didn't give me the right, he said. No, she agreed, but it gave me context. She picked up her gear. Context matters more than most people think. Vargas stood there for another second. Then he said quietly, "Come out of there in 15 minutes. That's the plan, she said. He walked away. At 1300, Tran found her. He sat down next to her at the table in the prep room, where she was reviewing the map of the dead zone's known quadrants. He didn't say anything for a while. He just sat there like someone keeping company with a decision they didn't make and couldn't change. "You know what I keep thinking about?" he said finally. "Tell me," she said, not looking up from the map. "I keep thinking about day one, Mateo. When you got out of the water after pulling Garrett out, you stood there dripping and you just started reorienting yourself. No drama, no looking around to see if anyone noticed." He paused. "That was the moment I started watching you differently." Emily looked up from the map. "Why?" she said. "Because I've seen people do hard things for an audience," he said. "And I've seen people do hard things because the alternative wasn't acceptable to them. And those two things look completely different from the outside if you know what to look for." He looked at her. "You were doing it because not doing it wasn't an option. There was no audience in your calculation." Emily looked back at the map. "There never is," she said. Tran sat with that for a moment. Then he said, "What are you going to do in there?" "I'm going to listen," she said, "to everything. To the environment. To myself," she said. "The environment is just information. What I do with it is the actual test." Tran was quiet. Then he said, "Okay, just that." She looked at him. "Okay," he said again, and there was something in the word that carried more weight than its single syllable had any right to. He got up and walked out. At 1358, Emily stood at the exterior entrance to the dead zone with her kit secured her map in her left hand and her radio clipped to her left shoulder. Reynolds stood 10 feet away. The rest of the team was positioned at the observation point, a reinforced structure 50 meters from the entrance, with screens fed by the dead zone's internal sensor array. They would be able to track her movement, see the automated responses, and watch every decision she made in real time. Webb was standing at the observation screen with his arms crossed so tightly his knuckles were pale. Cole was standing next to him. Vargas was looking at his watch. Tran was not looking at any screen. He was looking at the door. Reynolds walked to Emily and stood in front of her. "Last chance to withdraw," he said. "No, sir," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, long enough that something inside it stopped being about protocol. "Carter," he said, and his voice had lost something, some layer of command architecture that it normally carried, and what was underneath was just the voice of a man who wasn't entirely sure he was doing the right thing. "I'm going to be okay, Commander," she said. He looked at her. "How do you know that?" he said. "Because I've been preparing for this room my entire career," she said. "I just didn't know it was going to look exactly like this." Reynolds held her gaze. Then he stepped to the side. 1400, he said. The door opened. Emily walked in. The door sealed behind her. The observation room was completely silent. The first 60 seconds inside the dead zone told Emily three things. The first was that the automated response system was faster than the documentation had indicated, which meant either the documentation was intentionally incomplete or the system had been updated since the last public record. The second was that the terrain in the western sector had a different composition than the map showed, which meant someone had modified it recently, probably in the last 72 hours. The third was that her own heartbeat was elevated to approximately 140 beats per minute, which was higher than optimal, but within the range of functional performance if she didn't allow it to climb further. She noted all three things and kept moving. In the observation room, the sensor array showed her movement pattern as a line of data points on a topographic overlay. Webb was watching it with the specific attention of a man reading a language he hadn't known he understood until this moment. "She changed direction," Tran said quietly, watching the line shift. "She's not following the primary corridor," Cole said. "She can't," Webb said. "Look at the secondary response pattern. The system read her initial movement and seeded the primary corridor." He pointed at the screen. "If she'd stayed on the main path, she'd have triggered the sequence at the 40-meter mark. She saw it coming before the system fully committed." In the observation room, no one spoke for a moment. Then Vargas said very quietly, "How did she know?" "She's reading the system's logic," Webb said, "not the map. The logic behind the map." At 4 minutes and 30 seconds, the first major automated response triggered in the zone. A pressure variance in the eastern sector created a structural instability event in the floor surface of quarter 2. In the language of the system's engineering, it was designed to create a moment of physical panic, followed by a decision demand, specifically the demand of whether to stop retreat or continue across unstable ground. Most candidates stopped. Some retreated. A very few continued, and of those most completed the crossing, but at a cost in time and physical energy that accumulated into problems later in the sequence. Emily did none of those things. She stopped at the edge of the instability not because she was panicking, but because she was calculating. She spent 6 seconds, which felt like significantly longer, in the observation room, where Webb was watching the countdown clock in the corner of the screen, analyzing the distribution pattern of the unstable surface. Then she crossed it. Not through the center where the instability was deepest, not around it where the time cost was prohibitive. She crossed it along the edge at the specific point where the variance was lowest, moving in a pattern that distributed her weight laterally rather than vertically. 6 seconds to analyze. 4 seconds to cross. She mapped the variance, Hooper said from the back of the observation room. He had arrived at some point during the first 4 minutes without anyone noticing. She identified the load distribution characteristic and crossed on the margin. Reynolds looked at him. "That technique isn't in any of our training documentation," Reynolds said. "No," Hooper agreed. "It comes from structural engineering principles applied to emergency navigation." She read a paper on it, approximately 3 years ago, based on her personal development records. Reynolds stared at the screen. "She's been preparing for things that don't exist yet," he said. Hooper looked at him. "Where did you hear that?" "Someone said it to me recently," Reynolds said. "I'm starting to understand what it means." At 7 minutes and 20 seconds, the second major response triggered. A communications disruption event that shut down the radio frequencies the standard kit operated on. It was designed to create an information isolation condition, specifically the psychological experience of being cut off from support and operating without the awareness that someone else knew where you were. In the observation room, the radio feed went to static. Emily's signal disappeared from the audio monitor, but her position remained visible on the sensor array. Webb leaned forward. On the screen, her movement pattern didn't change. No hesitation, no pause, no change in velocity or direction that would indicate she had registered the loss of the radio as a crisis. "She expected it," Cole said. "She planned for it," Tran corrected. "There's a difference. Expecting something is passive. Planning for it means you've already decided what you do when it happens." Webb said nothing. He was watching the sensor line. She was moving through the zone with a rhythm that was almost recognizable. Not erratic, not desperate, but not mechanical either. It was the rhythm of someone who was thinking at full speed while their body handled the physical dimension of the environment on a separate track. At 9 minutes and 45 seconds, she reached the most dangerous section, the central containment area. It was the part of the dead zone that no one in the observation room had an easy time looking at on the screen, because the central containment area was where the system's full complexity expressed itself simultaneously. Multiple automated responses running at once. Environmental variables compounding. Decision demands arriving faster than anyone had designed a single person to handle them. The protocol existed specifically because of the central containment area. Because here even the best operators in the unit had made mistakes, had slowed down at the wrong moment, or sped up at the wrong moment, or made the correct individual decision and still found that the correct individual decision had triggered an unforeseen secondary consequence. Emily entered the central containment area at 9 minutes and 45 seconds, with 5 minutes and 15 seconds left on the clock. The sensor array lit up with system activity. In the observation room, Vargas uncrossed his arms. Cole took a half step forward without realizing he'd done it. Webb stopped breathing for a moment. Reynolds watched the screen and said nothing, and was more frightened than he would have admitted to any living person. The first demand arrived at the 10-minute mark, a pressure event that created a structural decision point, 2 routes with incomplete information about the composition of each. Emily stopped. For 2 full seconds, she stood still. The observation room was so quiet that Hooper could hear someone's watch ticking. Then Emily moved left. The right route collapsed 16 seconds later, behind where she had been standing. Vargas exhaled. "How?" he said. Not a full sentence, just the words stripped of everything except the pure inability to explain what he was seeing. The geometry, Webb said in a voice that was barely above a whisper. She's reading the system geometry, not the surface, the logic underneath the surface. At 11 minutes and 30 seconds, the second simultaneous demand arrived. An audio disruption combined with a light suppression event and a floor variance in the corridor she was moving through. Three things at once, designed to overload a single sensory processor. Emily kept moving. She wasn't fast. She wasn't slow. She was exactly the speed that the situation permitted. Given the information she had and the energy she needed to conserve for the remainder of the sequence. In the observation room, Tran said very quietly, "She's not fighting it." "No," Webb said. "She's navigating it," Tran said. "Like weather. Like she's not trying to beat it, she's trying to move through it." "That's exactly what she's doing," Hooper said from the back of the room. Everyone looked at him. "The optimal response to a complex compounding environment," Hooper said in the tone of a man reciting something he has thought about for a long time, "is not to attempt to dominate it. The optimal response is to understand its rhythm well enough to move with it. Most operators are trained to dominate. She is not trying to dominate," he paused. "She is trying to coexist with the environment long enough to exit it." 13 minutes, 2 minutes left. Emily was in the final quarter. The sensor array showed her moving at a steady pace toward the exit point. The system was running its final sequence, the accumulated pressure of 13 minutes of compounding variables now expressing itself in the last 200 meters of the course. Reynolds gripped the edge of the console without realizing he was doing it. At 13 minutes and 45 seconds, something happened that nobody in the observation room, including Hooper, had anticipated. Emily stopped. Completely. For 3 full seconds, she was motionless in the sensor array. 3 seconds that were completely inexplicable and absolutely terrifying from the outside. Vargas said, "What is she doing?" Nobody answered, because nobody knew. Then Emily moved again. Backward, 4 steps back the way she had come. Then left, 6 steps. Then forward. And as she moved forward on that new vector, the final automated sequence of the central corridor triggered on the path she had vacated. A collapse event. Complete. If she had been standing where she was 14 seconds earlier, the sequence would have triggered with her in it. In the observation room, nobody breathed. She had seen it. Somehow, with 2 minutes left on a 15-minute clock in an environment that had been specifically engineered to exhaust every sensory and cognitive resource a human being possessed, she had seen a sequence that hadn't fully committed yet and moved out of the way before it arrived. Cole made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Vargas put both hands flat on the console in front of him. Webb closed his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Then he opened them. "She read it," he said. "She read the pre-signal." "What pre-signal?" Cole said. "The system has a tell," Webb said. "A micro-vibration in the floor that precedes a collapse sequence by approximately 4 seconds. It's too subtle to feel under normal conditions." He looked at Cole. "She felt it." "How?" "Because she was listening to the ground," Webb said. "The equipment can fail. The preparation cannot." 14 minutes and 50 seconds. 10 seconds left. Emily Carter was walking the last 15 meters of the dead zone's final corridor at the same measured pace she had maintained since entering the zone. Not running, not celebrating, not collapsing under the weight of what the last 14 minutes and 50 seconds had cost her. Just walking. Like this was where she was supposed to be. Like this was what she had been built for. The steel door at the end of the corridor opened at exactly 15 minutes. Emily walked out. She stood in the transition area with the door closing behind her, the sound of the dead zone sealing itself back into silence for the first time in 15 minutes, and she adjusted her gloves. Just that. She adjusted her gloves and waited. Reynolds was the first one to reach her. He walked quickly from the observation structure to the transition area, covering the distance in under a minute, and when he came through the exterior door, Emily was standing there, gloves adjusted, expression calm, waiting. Reynolds stopped in front of her. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Permission to continue training, sir." Emily blinked. It took her a second to realize what he was doing. He was saying it for her, the thing she was going to say, the thing she always said. He was saying it first, because something in the last 15 minutes had rearranged the order of things. Emily held his gaze. Then she said, "Yes, sir. Permission granted." Reynolds nodded once. Then the rest of the team came through the door behind him and stopped when they saw her standing there, and the transition area held all of them in silence for a moment. Nobody spoke. Because sometimes what needs to be said doesn't have a word that fits it properly, and the most honest thing is to stand in the silence and let it be what it is. Vargas looked at her. She looked back. He nodded once. That was it. From Vargas, that was everything. Webb was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not assessment, not suspicion, something older and simpler than those things. The expression of someone who has just witnessed something they know they will be thinking about for the rest of their life. Cole wasn't looking at her face. He was looking at her hands, at the adjusted gloves, at the specific ordinary gesture she had made in the first seconds after walking out of the place that had just tried to break her. Tran was looking at the door she had come through, like he was trying to understand the door better by looking at it now that she had walked through it. Hooper, standing at the back, wrote something in his notes. And then Cole said in a voice that was rough around the edges in the way that voices get when something has moved through a person and left a residue, "You saw the pre-signal." Emily looked at him. "The floor vibration," he said, "for the collapse sequence. You felt it." Emily thought about it for a moment. "I didn't feel it," she said. Cole frowned. "Then how did you know to move?" Emily looked at him and at the rest of them, and then she said the thing that would stay with every single person in that transition area for years. "The system had been running its logic for 14 minutes, she said. "By the time I reached that corridor, I wasn't feeling what the ground was telling me about the present. I was reading what the pattern had been telling me about what came next." She paused. "I didn't respond to the signal. I anticipated the sequence." The transition area was completely quiet. She had not survived the dead zone by being better than it. She had survived it by understanding it. And the difference between those two things was the distance between everyone else who had walked into that facility and the person standing in front of them right now. Reynolds looked at his team looked at Emily, and something that had been broken for 18 days began slowly and irrevocably to mend. Not because anyone decided it should, but because the truth, when it finally lands in the right place, does not ask for permission. It simply settles. And this truth had settled. Completely. In the middle of the transition area outside the dead zone, in the specific silence of people who have just been shown something they cannot unknow. Vanguard 6 stood around Emily Carter and began, in the only way that real teams do, to become one. The night after the dead zone, nobody slept well. Not Webb, who lay in his bunk, staring at the ceiling and replaying the sensor data in his head, like a film he couldn't stop watching. Not Cole, who got up twice, walked to the window, stood there for a few minutes, and walked back without knowing what he was looking for. Not Vargas, who sat at the small desk in his quarters and wrote 3 sentences in a personal journal he hadn't touched in 4 months, then closed it without finishing the thought. Not Reynolds, who stayed in his office until 0100, reviewing something that was not training footage and not performance data. He was reviewing personnel records, specifically the records of the people who had been attached to or adjacent to Vanguard 6's operational planning over the previous 8 months. He had started doing this at 2200 initially without a clear objective. Just the low-level hum of a mind that processes things better when it has a task to perform, and couldn't stop moving even after the day's events had formally concluded. But by midnight, the hum had sharpened into something more specific. He was looking for a name. He didn't know the name yet. That was the problem. At 0100, he closed the records and sat in the dark for a while. Then he picked up a secure line and made a call that took 11 minutes to connect because of the routing protocols involved. When it connected, the voice on the other end said, "This is unexpected." "I need to know something," Reynolds said. "You know I can't confirm operational details, Jack." "I'm not asking about operational details. I'm asking about a structural question." He leaned forward. "The evaluation program that sent Carter to us. The dual assessment framework. How long has it been running?" A pause. "Why, Ma?" the voice said. "Because I want to know if what I'm looking at is the end of the assessment or the beginning of something else." Another pause, longer this time. "Get some sleep," the voice said. "There's a mission brief at 0800 tomorrow. Real world." The line disconnected. Reynolds stared at the phone. Real world. He hadn't received a real world brief in 6 weeks. Vanguard 6 had been in a training and rotation specifically scheduled to keep them stateside, while a diplomatic situation in one of three possible regions resolved itself or didn't. He thought about the timing, he thought about Emily, he thought about the call he had just made and the 11 words that had come back across it. Then he went to find Hooper. Hooper was awake, of course he was. Hooper was always awake at hours when the rest of the world expected people to be sleeping, because Hooper's mind operated on a schedule that had nothing to do with sunlight. He was in the small office he'd been assigned reading when Reynolds knocked. "Real world brief," Reynolds said. 0800. Hooper closed his book. "I know." Reynolds looked at him. "You knew before I called." "Yes." "How long have you known?" Hooper set the book on the desk. "Since yesterday morning." Reynolds came into the office and closed the door. "And you didn't tell me." "It wasn't my information to share," Hooper said. "The brief comes through your chain, not through me." "But it's connected," Reynolds said, "to Carter, to the assessment." Hooper looked at him for a long moment. "Everything is connected, Jack. That's the nature of what we're doing here." He folded his hands. "Get some sleep. You're going to want to be sharp tomorrow." Reynolds left. He did not sleep. At 0700, Emily was already in the prep room when the team arrived for pre-brief orientation. She was sitting at the table with a cup of coffee and a tactical map that she had apparently requisitioned from the planning office at some point before 0600. The map was not related to any of the standard training exercises. It was a regional operational chart. Webb walked in first, saw the map, and stopped. Then he looked at Emily. "Where did you get that?" he said. "Planning office opens at 0530, she said. "That map is restricted." "I have the appropriate clearance level," she said. "I checked before I requested it." Webb pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He looked at the map. Then he looked at her. "You knew about the brief." "I suspected," she said. "The timing felt deliberate." "What timing?" She looked at him. "The dead zone was yesterday. A real-world brief lands the morning after." That's not a coincidence in an environment like this. Either it was always scheduled and the dead zone was timed to precede it for evaluation purposes, or the brief was accelerated because of what happened yesterday. She took a drink of her coffee. "Either way, we're going somewhere." Webb studied the map for a moment. "How did you know which region?" he said. "I didn't," she said. "I pulled 3 maps. That one made the most sense based on the last 6 weeks of signals intelligence summaries I was able to access through my clearance." Webb looked at her. Emily looked back. "I told you," she said. "I never know which thing is going to matter." The rest of the team filed in over the next 10 minutes. Each one saw the map. Each one registered Emily's presence at the table with a posture that was different from anything they had produced in the previous 18 days. Not deference, not warmth exactly. More like the specific recalibration that happens when people stop filtering someone through a framework that was never accurate and start seeing what's actually there. Vargas sat down 2 seats from Emily and said nothing, but he sat without the deliberate distance that had characterized his positioning for the previous 2.5 weeks. He sat like she was part of the room, which in the architecture of Vanguard 6 was not a small thing. Cole sat across from Webb and looked at the map and then at Emily and said, "Which sector?" "Northern approach," she said. "If I'm reading the pattern right." Cole studied the map. "Based on what?" "Vehicular movement patterns cross-referenced with communication intercepts from the last 72 hours, she said. "The northern approach has the highest probability concentration." Cole looked at Webb. Webb looked at the map. Nobody challenged it. Reynolds walked in at 0758 with Hooper and a man nobody had seen before. A man in civilian clothes who carried himself with the specific posture of someone who had spent time in uniform and never fully left it behind. He was in his late 40s with a face that had been weathered by outdoor exposure and eyes that were doing a continuous unconscious assessment of every person in the room. Reynolds said, "Team, this is Director Callahan. He's briefing this morning's mission." Callahan put a folder on the table and stood at the front of the room. He looked at the faces in front of him. His eyes landed on Emily for a moment longer than on anyone else, but his expression didn't change. 3 days ago, he said, a 6-person survey team operating in a restricted research capacity was taken hostage by a militant organization that has been active in the northern sector for approximately 14 months. The team includes 2 American civilians, 1 allied national with diplomatic status, and 3 contracted security personnel. He opened the folder and slid photographs across the table. The holding location has been narrowed to one of 2 possible sites based on aerial surveillance and signals analysis. We have a 72-hour window before the organization moves them to a secondary location that we currently have no eyes on. The room was quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when the stakes shift from hypothetical to actual. Webb looked at the photographs. Tran leaned forward. Vargas's jaw tightened. The extraction corridor is narrow, Callahan continued. The primary approach has been compromised by an informant we haven't yet identified. The secondary approach requires crossing a terrain feature that our planning team has flagged as high risk due to recent modification. He paused. The tertiary approach is the one we're recommending. It's longer, operationally more complex, and requires a level of intelligence synthesis during execution that standard fire teams are not configured to provide in real time. Reynolds said, "That's where Carter comes in." Callahan looked at Reynolds for a moment. Then he looked at Emily. "Your clearance file says you built a specific analytical capacity for real-time intelligence synthesis under operational conditions during your time with the agency that doesn't officially exist." "That's accurate," Emily said. "The synthesis required for this mission involves cross-referencing live signals, data movement, pattern recognition, and structural analysis during active movement through the extraction corridor." He looked at her, in real time, with partial information. "That's what I do," Emily said. Callahan held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, "You'll be embedded in the primary infiltration element." Vargas looked at Reynolds. Reynolds looked at Callahan. Callahan continued. The briefing ran for 40 minutes. By the end of it, the team had the mission architecture, the insertion protocol, the extraction window, and the 3 contingency plans that would activate if the primary sequence was compromised. What they didn't have, and what Callahan acknowledged openly before he closed the folder, was a confirmed location. "We have 2 sites," he said. "Site Alpha has a 63% probability based on current intelligence. Site Bravo has 37. We will make the final location determination based on signals data collected in the 6 hours prior to insertion." He closed the folder. "That determination will happen in the field, in real time, by the intelligence element." He looked at Emily when he said the intelligence element. The room understood. The success of the mission did not depend on the team's combat capability. It depended on Emily reading the pattern correctly in the middle of an active operation with lives in the balance. After Callahan left, Reynolds stood at the front of the room and looked at his team. "Questions," he said. Webb said, "The compromised primary approach. The informant. Has he been identified?" "Not yet," Reynolds said. "So we're running a mission with an active leak in the pipeline," Webb said. "And we don't know where the leak is." "That's correct." The room absorbed this. Tran said, "What's our communication protocol if Emily's synthesis sends us to Bravo and Alpha was right?" "Contingency 3 activates," Reynolds said. 40-minute reset window. "We have the resources in position to execute both sites if the first insertion confirms negative." 40 minutes is tight, Cole said. "Yes," Reynolds said. "If Bravo was wrong," Vargas said slowly, like he was working through the math out loud, "and Alpha moves in that window, we lose the hostages." "Yes," Reynolds said again. Vargas looked at Emily. Emily held his gaze. "Don't be wrong," he said. "It wasn't hostile, one. It was the clearest version of trust he had available to express, which was to say, I need you to be right, and I am telling you that directly instead of pretending it doesn't matter." "I'll do everything I can," she said. Vargas nodded once. That was enough. Insertion was scheduled for 2200. The 15 hours between the brief and the operation were the particular kind of long that only exists in the hours before something real. Every member of the team moved through those hours in their own way. Webb ran a full equipment check twice and then a third time on specific components. Cole cleaned his kit and then reorganized it in a configuration he hadn't used before and then switched it back. Tran slept for 3 hours in the early afternoon with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned that the body needs what it needs, regardless of circumstances. Vargas spent 2 hours in the armory not touching anything, just sitting. The kind of sitting that isn't rest, but is something adjacent to it. Emily sat in the intelligence prep room for most of the afternoon and worked. She built a layered analytical model from every piece of signals data she could access. She mapped movement patterns, communication frequency, shifts, structural analysis of the two sites based on aerial imagery, and every piece of contextual intelligence in the available database that could weight the probability assessment in one direction or the other. At 1700, Hooper came in and sat across from her. He watched her work for a moment. "How's the model looking?" he said. Emily didn't look up. 6337 still holds, but there's a tertiary signal I keep circling back to. "What signal?" "Communication suppression event at Site Bravo," she said. 42 hours ago, a deliberate reduction in outbound signals that lasted approximately 90 minutes and then resumed at normal pattern. She pointed at a section of her notes. Suppression events like this are typically associated with one of three scenarios: a security protocol shift, a personnel transfer, or a location preparation. Hooper leaned forward slightly. "Location preparation," he said. "Meaning they may have been setting up Bravo as a holding site 42 hours ago," she said, "which would push the probability in that direction. But the aerial imagery from 36 hours ago doesn't confirm elevated activity at Bravo, which means either the suppression event was unrelated or the preparation was internal and didn't generate visible external activity." She sat back. "The problem is that if I'm right about the suppression event, Bravo climbs to 55-58%, but I can't confirm it from the available data. I'm reading a signal that might not be the signal I think it is." Hooper looked at her carefully. "What does your instinct say?" Emily was quiet for a moment. "Bravo," she said. Hooper sat with that. "But your instinct is based on incomplete data," he said. "My instinct is always based on incomplete data," she said. "Everyone's is. The question is whether the pattern I'm reading is real or whether I'm imposing a pattern on noise because I need one to exist." She looked at the notes. "That's the question I can't fully answer from here." "And in the field," Hooper said. "In the field, I'll have more data," she said. "I just won't have more time." Hooper nodded slowly. "Carter," he said. She looked at him. "Whatever happens tonight," he said, "you've already done what you came here to do." She looked at him for a moment. "What did I come here to do?" He smiled slightly. "You came here to show them what they were missing," he said. "You've done that." He stood up. "Tonight is something else. Tonight is the actual work." He walked out. Emily turned back to her notes. She worked until 2000. At 2000, she went to find Reynolds. He was in his office, standing, not sitting, with his hands in his pockets and the regional map on his wall, and the look of a man managing the specific weight of sending people he was responsible for into a situation that had known risks and unknown ones. He heard her at the door and turned. "Sir," she said, "I need to tell you something before we go in." "Tell me," he said. "The official probability model has alpha at 63%, she said. "I believe it's closer to 50-50, possibly weighted toward Bravo." She held his gaze. "I can't confirm it from available intelligence, but I wanted you to know that my read is different from the model before we're in the field, and I'm making real-time calls." Reynolds looked at her. "You're telling me this now," he said, "so that if you call Bravo in the field, I understand the basis for the call before it's happening." "Yes, sir." He was quiet for a moment. "And if you're wrong," he said, "then I'm wrong and the contingency protocols activate," she said. "But I'd rather you know the shape of my analysis going in than have me make a call in the field that looks like it came from nowhere." Reynolds looked at her for a long moment. "Do you know what that is?" he said. "What you just did by coming in here." "I gave you information you needed," she said. "You gave me your honest assessment, even though it contradicts the official model and puts you in the position of being wrong in a very visible way," he said. "That's not something most people do." Emily said nothing. Reynolds turned to the map. "If you call Bravo," he said, "we go to Bravo." That was it. No qualification, no contingency on his end, just a flat, complete statement of a commander who had made a decision about who he trusted and was ready to execute on it. Emily nodded once. "Thank you, sir," she said. She walked out. Insertion was at 2200. The team moved from the staging point in a configuration that Reynolds had personally adjusted at 1930 after reviewing Emily's analytical summary. Not the official model, Emily's model, the one that weighted Bravo higher and built the insertion sequence around the ability to pivot quickly if the field intelligence confirmed her read. The first hour of the operation was clean. The team moved through the insertion corridor without contact, without triggering the sensor architecture that the planning team had mapped as active, and without any deviation from the movement protocol that Webb had laid out in the final pre-mission brief. Emily was positioned in the primary element between Webb and Tron, with Cole forward and Vargas and two other operators forming the rear element. She was monitoring two signals feeds through the equipment she carried, cross-referencing in real time against the pattern model she had built that afternoon. At 23:17, the first field data point arrived, a communication signal from the direction of Site Alpha. Scheduled pattern, normal frequency, normal content profile. Emily processed it in 4 seconds. Normal pattern at a site where you were holding 6 hostages meant one of two things. Either the site was clean and the hostages weren't there because scheduled communication from a holding location was a significant operational risk that any competent organization would have suppressed, or the communication was deliberate, designed to maintain the appearance of normalcy for exactly the purpose of attracting attention to Alpha. Emily keyed her radio. "Webb," she said quietly. "Go," he said. "Alpha is running scheduled comms." A pause. "Significance," he said. "If they're holding 6 people at Alpha, scheduled outbound comms is a security failure," she said. "They're either not there or someone wants us to think they are." Webb was quiet for 3 seconds. "You think it's a flag?" he said. "I think the pattern is too clean," she said. "Yes." Another 3 seconds. "Continue current vector," he said. "I want your read at the next waypoint." "Roger." At 23:41, the second data point. Movement signature from the direction of Site Bravo. Not comms, physical movement detected through the secondary monitoring system as a heat signature pattern consistent with rotating personnel positions, which was exactly what you did when you were holding hostages and managing a security perimeter. Emily closed her eyes for 2 seconds, not because she needed to, but because it helped her run the calculation cleanly without visual interference. Then she opened them. "Webb," she said, "I'm here." "It's Bravo," she said. "Movement signature, rotating perimeter, consistent with active security protocol around a holding position." Silence. "Confidence," Webb said. 85%, she said. "Maybe more." Or longer silence. Then Reynolds' voice came over the command channel. He had been listening. "Carter," he said. "Sir, you said Bravo before we left." "Same rate by him. Stronger," she said. "The Alpha comms are too clean. Bravo has live perimeter activity. The pattern fits a holding site, not a supply point." Reynolds was quiet for exactly 5 seconds. "Webb," he said. "Commander," Webb replied. "Redirect to Bravo," Reynolds said. "Full element. We execute the Bravo sequence." Webb said, "Roger that." And then in a voice that carried something additional in it, something that wasn't strictly operational language, but was completely real, he said, "Good read, Carter." The redirect added 14 minutes to their movement timeline. 14 minutes in an operation with a narrow window was not nothing. Every member of the team felt those 14 minutes in the specific way that time pressure in a real operation is felt, not as anxiety exactly, but as a heightening of everything. Every sound more significant, every movement more deliberate, every decision carrying the weight of what came after it. They reached the Bravo perimeter at 0012. Emily was the first one to identify the guard rotation timing from the signals data she was monitoring. 4-minute cycle, she said to Webb. Window opens at 0016. "You sure about the timing?" Webb said. "The rotation has been consistent across 5 cycles," she said. 4 minutes to 12 seconds average, give or take. Webb looked at Cole. Cole looked at the timeline on his wrist. 0016, Cole confirmed. They held position. The next 4 minutes were the kind that can't be accurately described to anyone who hasn't been in them. The compressed total sensory awareness of a moment where everything that has come before has funneled into a single point, and the only thing that exists is what happens next. At 0016, the window opened. The team moved. What happened in the next 11 minutes was the kind of thing that training is supposed to prepare you for and almost never fully does, because the gap between the simulation and the reality is the gap between knowing what things feel like in theory and knowing what they feel like when they are happening to you. The team cleared the perimeter. They located the holding structure. Webb went in first. Cole covered. Tran moved to the secondary position. Vargas held the extraction corridor. Emily was at the signal station she had established at the outer perimeter, monitoring the communications environment and in real time tracking every signal that moved in or out of the area, looking for the thing that would tell her if anything was wrong before the team inside had a chance to find it themselves. At 0023, she found it, a communication signal, outbound, encrypted, short burst, from a source that was not in the Bravo position. From inside the extraction corridor, she processed it in 3 seconds. Then she keyed Reynolds directly. "Commander," she said. "Go," he said. "We have an outbound signal from inside our own perimeter," she said. "Short burst encrypted origin point is approximately 40 meters behind Vargas's current position." Reynolds didn't say anything for a moment. "Origin point," he repeated. 40 meters behind rear element, she said. "It went out 11 seconds ago." Reynolds' voice when it came back was very controlled, in the specific way that controlled things are when something significant is being held very tightly inside them. "Carter," he said, "are you telling me someone just signaled out our position from inside our own team?" "I'm telling you an encrypted signal originated from inside our perimeter, from a source I cannot attribute to our equipment," she said. "Yes, sir." Reynolds was quiet for 2 seconds. Then Webb. "Commander," Webb's voice from inside the structure immediately alert. "Accelerate extraction. We may have a compromised position." A pause. "Copy. How long do we have?" Emily was already running the calculation. Based on the signal's characteristics, the likely recipient, the probable response time of a force that had been given their position. 8 to 10 minutes, she said, maximum. "Move," Reynolds said. The team moved. The 6 hostages were located in the structure's interior holding room. All 6 alive, all 6 mobile enough to move under their own power. Webb had them out of the holding room in 90 seconds. Cole was already running the extraction corridor. Vargas had the rear and was moving backward with the specific disciplined urgency of someone who knew exactly how much time they had and exactly how much ground they needed to cover. Emily was running. She was running and monitoring, simultaneously splitting her attention between the physical reality of the terrain under her feet and the signals environment that was telling her what was coming before it arrived. At 0031, she said, "Reynolds, they're moving. Eastern approach, 3 minutes." "Extraction route," Reynolds said. "Western corridor is clean," she said. "Eastern is compromised. We cannot exit the way we came in." "Western corridor adds 6 minutes," Reynolds said. "I know," she said. "We have 3 minutes before they're on us," he said. "Then we need to run," she said. Reynolds said, "Hear that full speed Western corridor. Now." The team ran, and Emily Carter ran with them. Not in the rear, not protected. In the middle of the element with a hostage on her left arm and the signals monitor in her right hand moving at a pace that left no room for anything except the next step and the one after that. At 0039, they cleared the Western corridor boundary. At 0042, the Eastern approach behind them registered contact. At 0047, the extraction vehicle made contact with the team at the designated secondary pickup point. All 6 hostages. All 11 operators. Emily Carter. Nobody missing. In the vehicle as they moved away from the area at maximum safe speed, the team was breathing hard and not talking the particular silence of people who have just been through something that hasn't fully resolved into language yet. Then Cole said from the front of the vehicle, "The signal, the one Carter found, the outbound burst." Reynolds said, "We'll address it in debrief." "That was our compromise," Cole said, "the leak that hit our primary approach. It didn't come from outside." The vehicle was quiet. "It came from inside," Cole said. Reynolds said, "I said we'll address it in debrief," but everyone in the vehicle heard what wasn't being said. Emily had not just read the correct site location. She had not just navigated the signals environment during an active operation. She had identified in real time the source of the compromise that had been threatening the mission before anyone else knew there was a compromise to find. Webb was sitting 2 positions from Emily in the vehicle, and he looked at her and she looked back, and neither of them said anything. But something passed between them that was more complete than any sentence either of them could have constructed. Because the thing Emily had done tonight was not the thing she had been officially assigned to do. Her assignment was signals synthesis for site confirmation. What she had actually done was protect the team from something the team didn't know was coming. Not because anyone asked her to, not because it was in her operational parameters, but because not doing it was never in any universe Emily Carter operated in an option she was willing to accept. Vargas from the rear of the vehicle said without looking at her, without any preamble, in the flat voice of a man who has traveled a long distance to arrive at a simple truth. She was protecting us the whole time. Nobody argued, because nobody could, because it was true. It had been true since day one, since the water, since the navigation exercise, since the building clearance, since the dead zone. Since every moment in between that they had spent trying to decide whether she belonged, while she had already decided a long time before she walked through the gate that belonging was never the point. The point was the mission. The point was the people. The point was the thing you did when nobody was watching and nobody had asked, and the cost of doing it fell entirely on you. Emily sat in the vehicle and looked at the floor and let herself be exactly as tired as she was. No performance, no armor, just the real and complete exhaustion of a person who had given everything she had and then found more when it was needed. And around her, in the controlled noise of the moving vehicle, the team of Vanguard 6 existed in the specific altered state of people who have just discovered that the person they spent 3 weeks trying to break was the one who kept them whole. The debrief could wait, the questions about the signal could wait, the accounting of every decision and every outcome could wait. Right now there was only this: the vehicle moving through the dark, 6 people alive who weren't supposed to be, and 11 operators learning, some of them for the first time in their careers, what it felt like to have been wrong about something that mattered. Not the comfortable kind of wrong that stays in the past, the kind that changes you. The debrief happened at 0300, not because anyone wanted to be awake at 0300, but because the signal Emily had detected during the operation, the short encrypted burst from inside their own perimeter, was the kind of thing that could not wait for a reasonable hour. It was the kind of thing that, once identified, put everything else in a temporary holding pattern until it was resolved. Reynolds ran the debrief himself. No Callahan, no Hooper, just the team, the mission data, and the question that had been sitting in the vehicle with all of them for the entire ride back and was now sitting in the debrief room with the same weight it had carried since 0023. Someone had transmitted their position from inside the perimeter, from somewhere inside their own operational footprint. Reynolds put the signals data Emily had captured on the main screen. The burst transmission, the timestamp, the origin point coordinates relative to the team's positions at the moment of transmission. He let the team look at it. Nobody spoke for almost a full minute. Then Webb said, "Origin point is 40 meters behind Vargas's rear position at 0023. "Correct," Reynolds said. "That's our own corridor," Webb said. "Yes," Reynolds said. Tran leaned forward. "Who was in that corridor at 0023? Reynolds looked at the positioning data. "Rear element, Vargas Mitchell and our attached logistics coordinator." The room went quiet again, a different kind of quiet this time. The specific compression of a group of people arriving simultaneously at a thought they don't want to be having. Cole said, "What was the logistics coordinator's role in the mission?" "Equipment, verification and extraction, vehicle coordination," Reynolds said. "He wasn't a shooter," Cole said. "No," Reynolds said. "He had full access to the mission package," Webb said. "Timeline entry points extraction corridor." Reynolds didn't confirm or deny. He just looked at the screen. Emily had said very little since they entered the debrief room. She was sitting at the end of the table with the signals data in front of her, the original capture she had made during the operation, and she was going through it again with the same methodical attention she brought to everything. "At 0317, she said, Commander." Reynolds looked at her. "The encryption signature on the burst transmission," she said. "Can you put the full spectral analysis on the screen?" Reynolds looked at the technician running the display. The technician pulled up the full spectral data. Emily studied it for a moment. "This encryption pattern," she said. "I've seen it before." The room focused. "Where?" Reynolds said. "In the signals intelligence summaries I reviewed during mission prep yesterday," she said. "There was a communication intercept from 6 weeks ago that was flagged as low priority because it was attributed to a civilian contractor network in the region." She pulled her own notes from the mission prep session. "The spectral signature is identical." Reynolds stared at the screen. "Identical," he repeated. "Not similar," she said. "Identical. Same key structure, same burst duration pattern, same frequency hopping sequence." She looked at Reynolds. The person who transmitted from inside our perimeter last night has been using this encryption method for at least 6 weeks, and it was in the intelligence database the whole time. The room was completely still. Webb said very quietly, "It was flagged as low priority." "Yes," Emily said, "because it looks civilian," Webb said. "Because it was attributed to a civilian contractor network," she said, "which is what it was designed to look like." Cole stood up slowly. He walked to the screen and looked at the spectral data for a long moment. Then he turned around. "The logistics coordinator," he said. "How long has he been attached to this unit?" Reynolds checked the records. 8 months, he said, 8 months. The same 14 months the militant organization had been active in the northern sector, with an 8-month window that overlapped precisely with the period during which Vanguard 6 had experienced 2 mission compromises that had been attributed to external intelligence failures. Webb put his hand flat on the table. 8 months, he said. That's our primary approach, compromise. That's the leaked coordinates. That's both of them. Reynolds said nothing, because he was doing the same math and arriving at the same place, and the place he was arriving at was somewhere between operational rage and a very cold, very specific clarity about what had been happening to his unit for 8 months, while he had been looking in every direction except the right one. Emily said the 6-week-old intercept. If it had been analyzed with the current unit's communication signatures rather than attributed to the civilian contractor network, the connection would have surfaced then. "Why wasn't it?" Tran said. "Because the analysis pipeline doesn't routinely cross-reference internal unit signatures against regional civilian intercepts," she said. "There's no protocol for it. The assumption is that the internal element is clean and the threat is external." She said it without accusation, without any particular emphasis, just the flat statement of a structural gap in the system. But everyone in the room understood what the structural gap meant in context. The system had been designed with a blind spot, and someone had known about the blind spot and used it for 8 months. Reynolds stood up. He walked to the screen. He looked at the spectral data for a moment. Then he turned around to face the team. "The logistics coordinator has been detained," he said. "That happened 40 minutes ago before this debrief started. What I'm telling you now is that the investigation is active, and the details will follow through the appropriate channels." He looked at the team. "What I need you to understand right now is that the mission last night succeeded because we had a signals intelligence capability in this element that identified the compromise in real time." He paused. "We have 6 people alive tonight because of that capability." The room was quiet. Reynolds looked at Emily. "Carter identified the transmission," he said. "She identified it, assessed it correctly, and gave us the information we needed in time to alter the extraction before the compromised position was exploited." He stopped talking, because the next thing that needed to be said was not something a commander said to a subordinate in a debrief. It was something a person said to another person when they had been wrong in a significant way, and they understood that the wrongness had costs. He said it anyway. "I put you in this unit with the intention of finding your breaking point," he said. "I spent 18 days running every evaluation I could design against you because I was convinced that what was in your file didn't match what was actually there." He held her gaze. "I was wrong, and the ways in which I was wrong had consequences that I am going to be accounting for some time." The team was watching Reynolds, which was unusual in itself because the team watched the situation, not Reynolds. Reynolds was the constant, the fixed point. He did not make statements like this in debrief rooms at 0300. Emily looked at him for a moment. "You were doing your job," she said. "The job of a commander who needed to know the truth about every person in his unit." "I was doing my job badly," he said. "You were doing it the only way you knew how," she said. "The problem wasn't the intent. The problem was the framework." Reynolds looked at her. "The framework," he said. "You were measuring me against what you already know," she said. "But what I am doesn't fit inside what you already knew. So the framework kept returning false negatives." She held his gaze. "That's not a personal failure. That's a design limitation." The room was quiet for a long time. Then Webb said in the voice of someone who has been holding something for a while and is finally setting it down, "She's been telling us that the whole time, every day, every exercise, every time we pushed, and she absorbed it and kept going." He looked at the table. "She wasn't surviving our evaluation. She was showing us that the evaluation itself was the problem. Nobody argued. At 0400, Reynolds dismissed the debrief. The team filed out in the particular way that people move after something large has been processed, not slowly, but with the careful deliberateness of people carrying something fragile that they don't want to break. Vargas was the last one out except for Emily and Reynolds. He stopped at the door. He turned around and looked at Emily, who was still at the table gathering her notes. He said, "On day 9 in the equipment bay, I told you that what you were doing was noise." Emily looked up. "I remember," she said. "I was wrong," he said. "It came out simply without ceremony, the way real apologies do when they're not performing themselves. What you were doing wasn't noise. It was signal. I just didn't know how to hear it." Emily looked at him for a moment. "You heard it last night," she said. "That's what matters." Vargas nodded once. Then he walked out. At 0415, Reynolds and Emily were alone in the debrief room. Reynolds was looking at the spectral data still on the screen, the transmission that had almost cost them everything. "How long did you know?" he said. "Know what?" Emily said. "About the logistics coordinator." "About the leak." Emily thought for a moment. "I didn't know," she said. "I identified a signal anomaly in real time. The connection to the 6-week-old intercept I made in the debrief just now." Reynolds turned from the screen. "But you flagged the primary approach as compromised before we inserted." "I flagged it as potentially compromised," she said, "based on the intelligence pattern. I didn't know the source." "But you suspected it was internal," he said. Emily was quiet for a moment. "I thought the pattern of the compromise was inconsistent with an external source," she said carefully. "External sources typically produce broad disruption. What happened to our primary approach was surgical, very specific, the kind of specific that comes from someone who knows the protocol from the inside." Reynolds stared at her. "You knew this before the mission." "I suspected it," she said. "I didn't have evidence. I had a pattern that didn't fit the official explanation." "Why didn't you tell me?" She looked at him directly. "Because I came to you at 2000 with my probability assessment on the site location and you accepted it, Tom. If I had come to you at the same time and said, I also think there's an internal leak on the basis of a pattern interpretation with no direct evidence, it would have created a disruption in the mission planning that might have compromised the operation in a different way." She paused. "I made a judgment call. I kept the site assessment and the leak suspicion separate because I was more certain about one than the other." Reynolds was quiet for a long moment. "And you were right about both," he said. "I was right about the site," she said. "The leak revealed itself in the field. I didn't predict that. I responded to it." Reynolds looked at her. "There's a difference," she said, "between preparing for a pattern and predicting a specific event. I prepared for the possibility that the compromise was internal. I didn't know it would surface the way it did." Reynolds sat down heavily in the chair at the end of the table. Not the commander's posture. Just a man sitting down because the weight of the last several hours had accumulated to a point where standing was no longer the thing he needed to do. "Emily," he said. It was the first time he had used her first name. She looked at him. "Why did you come here?" he said. Not the operational question, not the program question, the actual question. "Knowing what this unit was going to put you through, knowing what I was going to put you through. Why did you agree to this assignment?" Emily thought about it seriously. "Because the units that don't know how to see what they're missing are the units that eventually fail in ways that cost lives," she said. "Not because the people in them aren't capable, but because capability without the ability to recognize capability in forms you don't expect is a closed system." She looked at him. "Closed systems fail. Always. Eventually." Reynolds was quiet. "And you thought you could open it," he said. "I thought it was worth trying," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "You could have made it easier," he said. "You could have pushed back earlier, reported the gear sabotage, escalated through Callahan, made the conditions of this evaluation visible to the people who designed it." "Yes," she said. "Why didn't you?" "Because the point wasn't to make it easier," she said. "The point was to let it be what it was and see what came out of it." She met his gaze. "You needed to see it for yourselves. If I had escalated, you would have resented the intervention. You would have adjusted your behavior without understanding why the adjustment was necessary." She paused. "You needed to see it without being told what to see." Reynolds sat with that. And do you think we saw it, he said. I think you're seeing it now, she said, which is not the same as having seen it on day one, but it's real, and real is what matters. Reynolds nodded slowly. Then he said, get some sleep. She stood up and gathered her notes. At the door, she stopped. Commander, she said. He looked at her. Webb was the first, she said, day one in the pre-dawn muster. He showed up and looked at me and said I was early. That was it. But the way he said it, there was something in it that wasn't what I expected. She paused. I held on to that. On the hard days, I held on to the fact that someone in this unit on the very first morning had given me one moment of something that wasn't dismissal. She looked at Reynolds. That matters more than I know how to say. She walked out. Reynolds sat alone in the debrief room until 0500. Then he picked up the phone and called the number that took 11 minutes to connect. When it connected, he said, I need to understand the full scope of what you design. The voice on the other end said, what specifically do you want to know? I want to know what the program expected to find when they sent her here, Reynolds said. And I want to know what they actually found. A pause. The program expected to find a unit with exceptional tactical capability and a significant structural blind spot in their talent recognition framework, the voice said, specifically around candidates whose capability profile didn't align with the conventional special operations model. And what did they find? Reynolds said. The same thing, the voice said, plus one thing they didn't anticipate. What thing? They found a unit that was capable of correcting itself, the voice said, when the evidence accumulated to a sufficient level. That's not a given, Jack. Most units in this situation maintain the blind spot because maintaining it is easier than acknowledging what it costs. A pause. Vanguard 6 corrected. That's not nothing. That's actually quite rare. Reynolds was quiet. And Carter, he said, what about her? What happens to her now? The line was quiet for a moment. That's not my decision, the voice said. Or yours. Whose is it? It's hers, the voice said. It's always been hers. The line disconnected. 3 days after the mission, the investigative team confirmed what the spectral analysis had pointed to. The logistics coordinator whose name was in the report and whose history with the organization that had taken the hostages stretched back further than 8 months had been feeding operational information for nearly a year. The 2 previous mission compromises attributed to external intelligence failures were recategorized. The primary approach compromise from the hostage rescue was logged as internally sourced. The report also noted in the final section that the real-time identification of the burst transmission during the operation had been the critical factor in preventing the exploitation of the compromised position. It attributed the identification to the signal's intelligence element. It named Emily Carter. Reynolds read the report twice. Then he wrote a 3-page evaluation addendum that he submitted through Callahan's chain directly to the program that had sent Emily. It was the most detailed performance evaluation he had written in his career. Not because the program required it, but because he believed that what had happened deserved an accurate accounting, and accurate accounting was the only kind Reynolds knew how to produce. The final paragraph of the evaluation said in Reynolds's characteristic flat language, this candidate demonstrated a level of operational capability that exceeded the parameters of this evaluation in every category that was assessed and in several categories that were not. More significantly, this candidate's presence within this unit over the course of the evaluation period produced a structural shift in the unit's talent recognition framework that I assess as durable and consequential. The cost of that shift was borne entirely by the candidate. The benefit accrues to the unit and to the mission going forward. I am recommending this candidate for the highest available classification within the program's placement framework, and noting for the record that this recommendation comes from a commander who spent the first week of this evaluation attempting to justify her removal. He read it once more, then he signed it and sent it. The conversation that changed Webb happened on the 4th day. He found Emily in the intelligence prep room, the same room where she had spent the afternoon before the mission building, the analytical model that had pointed them to Bravo. She was not building anything now. She was sitting with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, looking at nothing in particular. Webb sat across from her. What are you thinking about? He said. She looked at him. The gap, she said. What gap? The 6-week intercept, she said. It was in the database. The signature was there. It just wasn't connected to anything because the protocol doesn't look for that connection. She held the cold coffee cup. How many times does that happen? How many times is the answer sitting in the data and we're looking past it because the protocol tells us to look somewhere else? Webb looked at her. That's the question, isn't it? That's the question, she said. What do you do with it? He said. She thought for a moment. You change the protocol, she said. You build a system that looks for the thing the current system is designed to miss. She set the coffee down. That's not a tactical problem. It's a design problem. Webb was quiet for a moment. Is that what you did with us? He said. Identified the design problem. Emily looked at him. I identified that the system you were using to evaluate incoming personnel was calibrated against a specific profile and couldn't accurately assess anything outside that profile, she said. Yes. And you thought you could fix it by coming in here and being the thing that didn't fit the profile, Webb said. I thought I could make it visible, she said. I can't fix it. Only you can fix it. I can only show you where the gap is. Webb looked at her for a long moment. Carter, he said. Webb. When you walked into that briefing room on day one, he said, when Reynolds read you in front of everyone and called you a paperwork mistake, what were you thinking? Emily looked at the table for a moment. I was thinking that I had expected exactly that, she said. And I was thinking that the question was whether I could hold what I knew about myself steady against what they were telling me I was. She paused. Because if I couldn't hold it steady in a briefing room, I definitely couldn't hold it steady in the dead zone. Webb nodded slowly. Did it ever shake? He said. What you knew about yourself? She thought about it honestly. On day 12, she said. After Vargas came at me in the equipment bay, I went back to my quarters and I sat on the edge of my bunk and I thought maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the thing I know about myself is a story I've been telling myself, and this unit is just seeing the truth more clearly than I can. She looked at Webb. I sat with that for about 20 minutes. And then, he said, and then I thought about every specific thing I had done since day one, she said. Not the outcomes, the decisions, the specific choices I had made in specific moments. And I thought those are real. Those happened. Those cannot be revised by someone else's verdict about who I am. She picked up the cold coffee. After that, I went to sleep. Webb sat with that for a moment. Then he said, the team is going to be different after this. Good, she said. It's going to be hard for some of them, he said. Accepting that the framework was wrong, that they were measuring with a broken ruler and calling the results accurate. It's always hard to admit a broken ruler, she said. It's harder to keep using it once you know it's broken. Webb almost smiled. Almost. You know, Vargas requested you for the next training cycle, he said. Emily looked at him. As a planning consultant, Webb said, he put the request in yesterday through Reynolds. He wants you to review the mission planning protocol for the next rotation and identify structural gaps. Emily was quiet for a moment. Vargas, she said. Vargas, Webb confirmed. She sat with that. The man who had told her she was noise, asking her to help him find the signal. What did Reynolds say, she asked. Reynolds approved it before Vargas finished the sentence, Webb said. Emily looked at the table. Something moved across her face. Not triumph, not vindication. Something quieter and more complete than either of those things. The expression of someone who has been carrying a weight for a long time and has just been told in the most specific and practical way possible that the carrying was worth it. Okay, she said, just that. Webb stood up to leave. Webb, she said. Oh, he stopped. Day one mail, she said. Pre-dawn muster. You showed up and you said I was early. He looked at her. I know, he said. I remember. Why did you say it like that, she said, like it was something worth noting. Webb thought about it. Because it was, he said. Will people show up exactly on time or a little late? Because those are the two options that make sense from outside. Early doesn't make sense from outside. Early means you decided the place mattered before anyone told you it did. He paused. I noticed that. I filed it. Emily looked at him. And then you still spent 2 weeks trying to prove I didn't belong, she said. Webb held her gaze. Yes, he said. Why? He was quiet for a moment. Because filing something and being ready to act on it are different things, he said. I saw something real on day one and then I let the framework override it for 2 weeks because the framework was more familiar than what I was seeing. He paused. That's the thing I'm going to be thinking about for a long time. Emily nodded. Me too, she said. He walked out. 2 weeks after the mission, a classified communication arrived for Emily through the program's secure channel. She read it alone. It was an offer, not a conventional posting, not a standard assignment within an existing structure. Something new. A program that was being built from the ground up, designed specifically to do the thing that had never been done properly before, develop and place unconventional talent within elite units in a way that was systematic rather than accidental, structured rather than dependent on the specific circumstances of one evaluation in one unit at one particular moment. The program needed someone who understood both sides of the gap, the talent that didn't fit the existing model, and the structure that needed to be changed to see it. The communication was asking Emily if she would build it, not run it as an administrator. Build it, from the design principles up. The assessment frameworks, the placement protocols, the systems for identifying structural blind spots in elite units, before those blind spots became operational failures. She read it twice. Then she sat alone for a long time. She thought about the 6-week intercept that had been in the database for 6 weeks without anyone connecting it to anything. About all the things that were sitting in plain sight in systems that weren't designed to look for them. About all the people who were what she was, who had spent years preparing for things that didn't exist yet, who walked into rooms and watched the room configure itself against them and decided every day that the alternative to showing up was worse than the cost of showing up. She thought about Garrett Cole in the water, about Webb on the morning of day one, about Vargas saying "don't be wrong" in the pre-mission brief and meaning it as the most complete version of trust he had available, about Reynolds writing a 3-page evaluation addendum that nobody required him to write, about the dead zone and the moment she backed up 4 steps and felt the floors in tension before it arrived and moved out of the way of something that hadn't happened yet. She thought about all of it. Then she picked up a pen and she wrote one word on the response form: yes. 3 months later, Vanguard 6 ran their first integrated assessment under the new protocol Emily had designed. A protocol that evaluated incoming candidates not against the unit's existing performance standards, but against the unit's operational needs, including the needs the unit hadn't yet identified in themselves. Webb ran the first day's muster. When the newest candidate arrived, a 24-year-old cryptographic analyst with no combat history and a file that looked on the surface impossible, Webb met him at the gate. He looked at the candidate's face. He said, "You're early." The candidate said, "Yes, Sergeant." Webb nodded once and filed it. Down the hall in the intelligence prep room, a program manual was sitting on the desk. Its cover page said in plain text, "No classification header, no operational designation, a framework for recognizing what you're missing." The author line said E. Carter. Nobody at the Naval Special Warfare Center in Coronado knew the full scope of what Emily Carter had been, or what she had built in the months since she walked out of the dead zone. The people who needed to know, knew. The people who didn't worked inside the results of her work without being aware of it. That was how she had always operated, quietly, without applause, without waiting for permission. True excellence does not need to announce itself, does not need validation, and does not need an audience to be real. It shows up in the early morning before anyone else arrives. It backs up 4 steps when the floor whispers something the protocol hasn't accounted for yet. It goes back into the cold water because leaving someone behind was never in any version of the story an option. It walks out of the dead zone, adjusts its gloves, and waits. And the world eventually catches up. Emily Carter was that truth, walking forward one decision at a time. She always had been.